Justice isn't always blind, but sometimes it's personal. In a world where secrets can stay hidden behind wealth and power, one journalist's courage and a father's fierce love for justice collide in a battle that could cost them everything. What happens when a cop meant to protect becomes the predator? And when justice strikes closer to home than anyone expected? Stay with us as we uncover a story of resilience, betrayal, and redemption that you'll never forget. Welcome to our channel, where we bring you stories that touch the heart and stir the soul. We dive into tales of courage, sacrifice, and the pursuit of justice, stories crafted to inspire and ignite change. Your support fuels our passion. So if you haven't already, please subscribe. Sandra Henderson walked the crowded city streets, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, her notepad filled with scribbled notes, and her mind whirling with the fragments of a dark story. She was a journalist, one who didn't shy away from getting her hands dirty if it meant unearthing the truth. But this time, the stakes were higher, and her instincts told her this was a story more dangerous than any she'd tackled before. Not only was she facing powerful people with deep pockets, but she was also 5 months pregnant, a fact that weighed heavily on her as she continued to dig into one of the most disturbing cases of her career. The case centered around Mr. Edward Shaw, a wealthy businessman with an untarnished public image, a man whose name alone opened doors and silenced questions. But Sandra's sources whispered a different story about him, one that spoke of manipulation, abuse, and twisted power. The whispers led her to Loretta, a teenage girl caught in Mr. Shaw's web of influence. Loretta had been just another face in the crowd before she was drawn into Shaw's world, a place of lavish parties, powerful connections, and secrecy. And now, Loretta was trapped, her life changed forever. Over the past few days, Sandra had pieced together bits and pieces of Loretta's story. The young girl had been flattered by Mr. Shaw's attention at first, her innocence making her blind to his true intentions. But that innocence had been shattered when she realized Shaw wasn't the charming father figure he pretended to be. Instead, he'd groomed her, pulling her deeper into his twisted world, where his wealth and power ensured no one would question his actions. For Sandra, this case had gone beyond just a story. It had become personal. Loretta's tear-streaked face haunted her, each interview peeling back layers of the horrors she'd endured. The young girl's life had been ripped apart, and all Sandra wanted was to expose Shaw and the system that protected him. But it was easier said than done. Every time she got close, she hit a wall. Powerful lawyers, bribes, and anonymous threats had been placed in her path. Her editor had suggested dropping the story, hinting that it was too dangerous, too volatile. But Sandra couldn't let it go. There was something about Loretta's quiet pain that struck her deeply. And with her unborn child on the way, Sandra found herself driven by a fierce desire to create a safer world for all children, a world where people like Shaw would be held accountable. Her husband, Mark, had begged her to be cautious, pleading with her each night after hearing about the day's work. "Sandra, please," he'd said just the night before. "It's not just you anymore. You've got a baby to think about." Sandra had held his hand, feeling the worry in his grip, but she'd only given him a gentle smile. "Mark, if I don't tell this story, who will? Loretta deserves justice. She deserves someone who's not afraid to stand up for her." The words had only slightly eased Mark's fears. He knew her well enough to understand that nothing would stop her. Sandra was as stubborn as she was brave, and once she latched onto a story, she wouldn't rest until she saw it through. But he'd made her promise to be careful, a promise she intended to keep. Yet Sandra had no idea how close danger truly was. She hadn't noticed the car that seemed to be lingering outside her apartment for the past few days, or the shadowy figure watching her from across the street when she interviewed people connected to Shaw. Her every step was being monitored by someone who had been instructed to make sure she never finished her story. Despite the invisible threat, Sandra pressed forward, her days filled with interviews, phone calls, and late-night research sessions. Witnesses were hard to come by. Many were too afraid to speak out, fearing that Shaw's reach was too long and too powerful. But Sandra's persistence paid off when she found a former employee willing to talk, a man who had seen enough to confirm Loretta's story. The man's voice shook as he recounted tales of Shaw's manipulation, of young girls brought to his private parties, and of employees paid handsomely to keep silent. Each piece of evidence Sandra collected felt like a triumph, but also a weight, pressing down on her with the knowledge of the powerful people she was challenging. The fear was real, gnawing at her in moments of quiet, yet she held fast. Justice for Loretta and others like her was worth every risk she took. The closer she got to exposing Shaw, the more she felt like she was walking on a razor's edge. She could sense the shadows closing in around her, but she pushed those thoughts aside. Loretta's story had to be told, and Sandra was willing to do whatever it took to reveal the truth. What she didn't know, however, was that her persistence had triggered a deadly response. Shaw had friends in law enforcement, and one in particular, Officer Robinson, had just been instructed to handle the situation. As Sandra finished her latest round of interviews and packed up her things that evening, she felt a sense of accomplishment, a step closer to justice. She glanced down at her growing belly, a mixture of pride and worry filling her. She was fighting not just for Loretta, but for the world her child would grow up in. Sandra had never realized just how deep the shadows could go. Her investigation had turned into a maze of secrets, and she was in much deeper than she knew. Mr. Shaw, a man of immense influence, was furious. With his public reputation on the line and a lifetime of dark secrets at risk, he was determined to silence her. He wouldn't take any chances. Sandra's story would never see the light of day if he had his way. He called on Officer Robinson, a man who had proved time and again to be reliable when it came to handling problems that required a bit more force and a lot less legality. Robinson was a cop who had fallen far from the ideals of his badge. Known for his heady-handed tactics and a mean streak, he wasn't afraid to use his position to intimidate or hurt those who challenged him. And he despised reporters, especially ones like Sandra, who dug too deep into matters that, in his opinion, should remain buried. When Shaw summoned him, Robinson was more than willing to take on the task. He had been given specific instructions. Scare her. It was to look like an accident, just enough to make Sandra think twice about continuing her investigation. But deep down, Robinson had his own agenda. This woman was prying into areas that could expose not only Shaw, but his own past misdeeds as well. He'd done Shaw's dirty work before, and he couldn't afford to have someone like Sandra piecing it all together. So, in his mind, a simple scare wouldn't be enough. On the night it happened, Sandra had stayed late at an old office building downtown, following a lead on Loretta's story. The streets were empty as she wrapped up her interviews and gathered her belongings, carefully tucking away her notepad, voice recorder, and camera. The city felt unusually silent, with only the distant hum of traffic and a few flickering streetlights illuminating her path. She clutched her notes close to her chest, feeling both accomplished and a little uneasy, but brushing off the feeling as nothing more than late-night nerves. She was deep in thought, her mind running through the pieces of her investigation. She felt she was close to something big, but she couldn't shake the heavy feeling that came with knowing she was stepping on some powerful toes. Lost in her thoughts, Sandra was completely unaware that Officer Robinson's car was parked just around the corner, his eyes fixed on her as she approached the street. From where he sat, Robinson clenched the steering wheel, a sneer curling across his lips. He waited, watching as Sandra moved closer to the curb, his fingers twitching with anticipation. His orders had been clear, but tonight, Robinson felt like taking things into his own hands. He wasn't just going to scare her, he wanted to make sure she'd remember the lesson for the rest of her life, if she survived it. The moment Sandra reached the edge of the sidewalk, Robinson's hand flew to the ignition, and his car engine roared to life. Breaking the quiet of the night, Sandra froze, her head snapping up to see the glare of headlights barreling down the narrow street. In that split second, every instinct she had kicked in. She gasped, her feet moving on their own as she stepped back, her pulse hammering as she realized the car wasn't stopping. It was accelerating. Robinson pressed down hard on the gas pedal, his grin widening as he imagined the outcome. This nosy reporter would never know what hit her. His car surged forward, headlights glaring brighter, a speeding shadow in the night. But just as the vehicle was about to reach her, Sandra managed a desperate leap backward, her body twisting out of the car's path. She felt the car's side mirror brush against her arm, the force enough to throw her off balance and send her sprawling onto the sidewalk. She landed hard on her side, pain jolting through her as she instinctively wrapped her arms around her belly, shielding her unborn child. The world spun, her ears ringing, her heart thundering as the car screeched to a stop a few feet away. For a split second, Robinson considered backing up to finish the job, but he saw movement in the nearby windows. Witnesses. He cursed under his breath, throwing one last glare in her direction before speeding away into the night. Sandra lay on the cold concrete, her body trembling as she processed what had just happened. Her mind raced, struggling to comprehend the reality of it. Someone had just tried to kill her. Her hands shook as she pushed herself upright, breathing hard and pressing her palms to her belly, relief washing over her as she reassured herself that her baby was unharmed. But the terror lingered, wrapping around her like a thick fog. This was no random accident, no coincidence. The car had come for her, and whoever was behind it had meant for her not to walk away. Gathering her strength, Sandra stumbled to her feet, her legs wobbly but determined. She knew, deep down, that this was a message, a brutal, unmistakable warning. Shaw and his allies had decided to silence her, and they had been willing to go to deadly lengths to make that happen. In that moment, Sandra realized that her investigation was far from over. She had more than just a story to chase down. She had enemies to uncover and a truth to expose. And now, they'd given her an even stronger reason to see it through. This wasn't just about justice for Loretta. It was about making sure people like Shaw could never get away with hurting innocent lives again. With a deep, steadying breath, she reached for her phone, dialing the only person who would understand the depths of what she faced: her father. She hadn't wanted to involve him before, but now, with her life on the line, she needed his help. Chief Henry Lawson had spent most of his life fighting crime and rooting out corruption in his city, earning a reputation as a no-nonsense leader who valued justice above all else. He had never been the type to look the other way, even when it meant going up against powerful figures or risking his own safety. For over 25 years, he had worn his badge with pride, dedicated to protecting the people in his community and upholding the law. But when he found out that his daughter, Sandra, had narrowly escaped death in a staged accident orchestrated by a cop under his own command, his fury knew no bounds. The discovery came to him in fragments. The night of the attack, Sandra had called him, her voice shaking as she recounted the terrifying close call. She didn't have the details, only a feeling of dread. "Dad," she whispered, "someone tried to kill me." He felt his heart seize, but he stayed silent, listening carefully to every detail. She described the car, the sound of the engine roaring, the brief glimpse she caught of the driver's face. That was enough. Lawson's mind raced as he pieced together the clues. There was only one officer he knew with a history of rough tactics who would take such a twisted lesson this far: Officer Robinson. The confirmation came swiftly. Lawson pulled footage from the traffic cameras in the area, watching as the car barreled down on his daughter, a move too precise to be accidental. His anger deepened as he saw Robinson's vehicle on the footage, his license plate caught clear as day. This was no random incident. It was targeted, deliberate, and the hand behind it was one of his own officers. The cold reality settled over him. Someone in his department had been co-opted by Shaw's allies, and it was Officer Robinson. The news hit him like a punch to the gut. Sandra, his own daughter, was now a target. She hadn't told him much about her investigation, wanting to protect him from any fallout her story might bring. But he knew his daughter well enough to understand she'd landed in something serious. She had always been tenacious, unyielding in her pursuit of the truth. She was just like him in that way. And now, because of her bravery, she'd been marked. Chief Lawson's hands trembled as he clenched his fists, feeling a deep, seething anger that he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a crime. It was a violation, a personal attack on everything he stood for. It wasn't only about Sandra's safety. It was about the justice system he had dedicated his life to. Someone was using his own department to intimidate and silence his daughter. The very thought made his blood boil. The twist, and perhaps the fatal mistake for those who'd threatened Sandra, was that Officer Robinson had no idea who she was. To him, she was just another nosy reporter who needed to be put in her place. Robinson hadn't known that Sandra was Chief Lawson's daughter, or that the chief had connections that went far beyond the station. Robinson had been ordered to do a scare job on her by Shaw's associates, but his arrogance and brutal methods had pushed him too far. Now he was no longer just dealing with a reporter. He was about to face the wrath of one of the most respected and feared men in law enforcement. The night after Sandra's close call, Chief Lawson didn't sleep. He spent hours poring over every file, every case where Robinson's name appeared, and any detail he could find about Robinson's connections. By dawn, he had already summoned his closest allies within the department, men and women who had worked beside him for years and knew the weight of his integrity. Lawson was meticulous, determined to find every loose thread that connected Robinson to Shaw. And with each piece of information he uncovered, his determination grew stronger. Robinson had been reckless, leaving traces of his involvement in various suspicious cases. It didn't take long for Lawson to start connecting the dots. He moved with a precision that could only come from years of experience, quietly calling in favors, seeking out records, and interviewing people who had encountered Robinson's wrath. He wanted to gather enough evidence to ensure there was no way Robinson could slip through the cracks. And once he had the evidence he needed, he launched an internal investigation, one that would put Robinson in the spotlight. But Chief Lawson wasn't just going to stop at Robinson. He was going to expose everyone involved, even if that meant shaking the very foundations of the city's political landscape. When Robinson first got word that he was under investigation, he shrugged it off, thinking it was just another routine inquiry. But soon, he began to feel the walls closing in. Rumors swirled around the precinct. Colleagues who had once turned a blind eye to his actions now avoided him, whispers trailing in his wake. Robinson realized too late that he was up against someone who wouldn't be swayed or scared off. He tried to cover his tracks, shredding documents and calling in favors from those who owed him. But Chief Lawson was relentless. He had anticipated every move Robinson would make. Bit by bit, the chief pulled in evidence. Witnesses who had been silent about Robinson's abuses found courage under the chief's protection. Former victims of Robinson's brutal tactics came forward, sharing accounts of intimidation, coercion, and outright assault. Lawson built his case like a fortress, brick by brick, and soon the web that had protected Robinson began to unravel. The shock finally hit Robinson when he discovered that Chief Lawson was Sandra's father. A chill ran down his spine as he realized just how severe his miscalculation had been. This wasn't just an investigation, it was personal, and the chief wasn't going to stop until Robinson was exposed for everything he had done. Desperation set in. Robinson knew he had to make a choice, try to flee or face the consequences of his actions. But running wasn't an option. Lawson had anticipated it and made sure there was no escape route left. Every favor Robinson tried to call in fell flat, as those he once counted on distanced themselves, unwilling to get caught in the fallout. Within days, the truth about Robinson's orders, his alliance with Shaw, and his web of corruption came to light. The final blow came when Lawson, armed with irrefutable evidence, presented the findings in a formal police meeting. Surrounded by his trusted officers, Lawson laid out Robinson's crimes, exposing not only his involvement with Shaw, but his years of abuse under the cover of his badge. The room fell silent as the full extent of Robinson's betrayal sunk in. His once defiant smirk faded, replaced by a look of dread. For Chief Lawson, Justice was not just about his daughter's safety. It was about purging his department of the corruption that had poisoned it from within. He had taken down the very people who tried to hurt his daughter, turning the tables on them with a quiet, searing fury. As Robinson was led away in handcuffs, the chief's gaze never wavered, a silent reminder that justice was a promise he would always keep, no matter the cost. The courtroom was silent as the trial of Officer Robinson began, the tension almost palpable in the air. Rows of people, journalists, and curious onlookers filled the benches, each one eager to witness the downfall of a man once shielded by his badge. Every person in that room knew they were about to witness the unveiling of a scandal that had festered for years, infecting the very heart of the justice system. Sandra sat quietly near the back, clutching her hands in her lap, her gaze never wavering from the stand where Robinson would soon face judgment. She could feel the weight of her father's work in this room. Every page of evidence he had painstakingly gathered, every testimony he had encouraged from people too afraid to speak, all had led to this moment. She could see the resolve in her father's face as he sat in the front row, unflinching, ready to see justice through. As the trial began, the prosecution laid out a chilling account of Robinson's abuses. Witness after witness took the stand, their voices strong and steady, recounting the intimidation, coercion, and fear Robinson had instilled in those he was sworn to protect. Some were victims of his abuse of power, others employees who had been threatened or paid off to look the other way. Each testimony painted a dark portrait of a man who had allowed corruption to guide his actions and terrorize those who dared to question him. One of the most damning testimonies came from a young woman, her hand shaking slightly as she described her run-ins with Robinson while working for Mr. Shaw's company. She revealed how Robinson had acted as Shaw's enforcer, protecting his employer's dirty secrets while ensuring that those who knew too much stayed silent. Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of how deep Shaw's influence ran and how much power Robinson had wielded at the expense of innocent lives, particularly those like Loretta's. Loretta's story was presented with raw, haunting detail. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as they heard how she had been manipulated and trapped, enduring horrors she was still struggling to overcome. Her testimony, fragile yet resolute, was a reminder of the innocence stolen from her. For Loretta, this trial was only the beginning of her healing journey. She would need extensive medical and psychological care to begin reclaiming her life. This trial wasn't only about justice, but about giving her the freedom to heal. Chief Lawson watched each testimony with an expression that conveyed both satisfaction and heartbreak. He had wanted to believe in the goodness of his department, but now, faced with the reality of its betrayal, he knew he had done the right thing. He glanced back at Sandra, whose courage in exposing Shaw had been the catalyst for all of this. Her tenacity had not only protected others, but had brought the darkness to light. As the prosecution continued, they presented the evidence Chief Lawson had meticulously compiled. Photographs, documents, and even video footage captured from nearby surveillance on the night Robinson had tried to harm Sandra were displayed, each piece cementing his guilt. The courtroom gasped as they watched the footage showing Robinson's car swerving toward Sandra, a grim reminder of how close she had come to death. When Robinson took the stand, his face was a mask of indifference, but there was an underlying tension in his jaw, a flicker of fear in his eyes as he realized the extent of Lawson's case against him. He attempted to defend himself, to justify his actions as mere mistakes or orders he'd carried out under pressure. But his explanations rang hollow, each word digging him deeper into the pit of his own making. The prosecution was relentless, and soon, the facade of calm he had tried to maintain began to crack. His voice shook as he tried to counter the prosecutor's questions, but every lie he spun unraveled with the weight of the evidence against him. Finally, the judge looked down upon Robinson, his face set in an expression of stern resolve. There was no mercy in his eyes as he spoke. The room fell silent, every person holding their breath as they awaited the verdict. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as he condemned Robinson's actions, sentencing him not only for attempted assault on Sandra, but for the years of corruption he had built under the guise of law enforcement. The judgment was severe, a clear message that justice would not be lenient toward those who abused their power. As Robinson was led out in handcuffs, his defiant glare faded, replaced by a hollow look of defeat. The courtroom watched as he was taken away, the reality of his punishment sinking in. His years of bullying and corruption had finally caught up to him, and now he would pay the price. Sandra felt a swell of relief and gratitude as the judge moved on to the next case. Mr. Shaw's, a powerful businessman who had hidden behind his wealth, exploiting and manipulating with impunity, would now face his own reckoning. With Lawson's evidence and the testimonies of those brave enough to come forward, the prosecution painted a chilling portrait of Shaw's influence, his connections, and the lives he had destroyed. By the end of the trial, Shaw's fate was sealed. His empire of lies crumbled before him, and the judge ensured his sentence matched the gravity of his crimes. As the courtroom emptied, Sandra lingered, a quiet moment of reflection washing over her. She looked at her father, her heart brimming with pride. Chief Lawson had fought not just as a father, but as a man who believed in justice, even if it meant exposing his own department's corruption. She walked over to him, and for a moment, they stood in silent understanding. They had fought together, in their own ways, and today, justice had prevailed. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt warmer, brighter. Sandra took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle within her. She had nearly lost everything, her life, her unborn child, but she had survived, and the truth had come to light. As she walked down the courthouse steps, she knew her work wasn't done. Loretta, now free from Shaw's influence, still had a long road to recovery, one that would involve doctors, therapists, and a supportive community to help her reclaim the innocence that had been torn away. For Sandra, Loretta's freedom symbolized a victory, but it also served as a reminder of the battles still left to fight. There were more stories to tell, more voices to uplift. She was a survivor, and now more than ever, she felt a renewed strength in her purpose. In that moment, she made a silent promise to herself and her child. As long as there were secrets to uncover, she would be there, ready to reveal the truth for those who couldn't. Thank you for watching and joining us on this journey. We hope you felt the power of this story as much as we did crafting it for you. Before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.